She had never heard anything. Not rain on a window, not her mother's voice calling her name across the kitchen, not traffic, not music, not the creak of floorboards, not the sound of her own breathing. 47 years. Bilateral sensorineural hearing loss from birth. Profound, the kind classified at over 90 decibels, the kind where even maximum amplification hearing aids deliver nothing useful. Sound was not a diminished part of Claire's world. It was simply absent from it, the way ultraviolet light is absent from human vision, not lost, never there. She had built a full life in that silence. A good one. She teaches American Sign Language at a community college in Eugene, Oregon. She's done it for 19 years. A person who lives entirely in visual language, who structures the world through what she sees and not what she hears, who navigated 47 years of human experience through a channel that never included sound. And then, one Tuesday in November, her heart stopped. And in the 4 minutes and 22 seconds that followed, Claire heard a voice for the first time in her life. 3 words. She's been trying to explain what that means ever since. The procedure was supposed to be routine. She'd been having symptoms for a few weeks. Atypical fatigue, occasional tightness in her chest, shortness of breath climbing stairs. Her cardiologist ordered a coronary angiography, a catheter threaded up through a femoral artery, contrast dye injected, imaging of the coronary arteries in real time. Standard diagnostic procedure performed thousands of times a day. She was mildly sedated, awake, stable on the monitor. The monitor went to V-fib 4 minutes into the procedure. Ventricular fibrillation. The electrical system of the heart stops coordinating and begins firing in chaos. The heart isn't beating, it's quivering. Blood stops circulating. Within seconds, the brain starts losing oxygen. The cath lab team moved immediately. Epinephrine, compressions, defibrillation at 200 joules. Asystole for 4 minutes and 22 seconds before they got her back. Sinus rhythm. Blood pressure stabilized. She was moved to recovery. She woke up 11 minutes later. The scrub tech, I'll call her Maria, was beside her, holding her hand. And Claire's first words, signed with hands that were still faintly trembling, were, "Is the voice part of this place, or did I bring it with me?" I connected with Claire about 3 months after the procedure. She'd found something I'd written about NDE research in an online group and sent a message. We arranged a video call. Her interpreter was present, and Claire was precise, careful, and methodical. The way someone trained in linguistics is careful when language has to carry something language wasn't built for. She said the experience began the moment her body became irrelevant. Not when I left my body. Not when I floated up. She said, the body just stopped being the point. She described it the way you might describe a room when the projector breaks. You stop watching the screen and start noticing what the screen was hanging in front of. There was light. She described it not as a color but as a temperature. A warmth that had brightness as a property but wasn't about seeing. There were presences nearby, not visible, not arranged around her in a spatial way she could map, more like the awareness of someone thinking intensely about you from across a great distance. Not quite sight, not quite hearing, something deeper than either. And then the voice arrived. She paused there for a long time before she continued. I've been in enough of these conversations to recognize when someone is trying to find language that exists for something that doesn't have language yet. She said, I want to be careful here because I know what heard means, and I know I don't have the mechanism for it. But there is no other word. I heard it. I asked her to describe the difference between that and, say, reading words in her mind, the inner experience of text, of sign, of language as she processes it every day. She shook her head. She said, "When I read a word, there is a step. There is the symbol, and then there is meaning. Even in ASL, even when I'm fluent, there's a process, a translation, however fast. What happened in that space had no step. The meaning and the sound arrived as the same thing simultaneously, not one leading to the other, both at once. I have read about music my entire life. I know what it supposedly does to people. This was not the description of music. This was music." The voice said 3 words. "You are enough." She sat with that in silence for a moment after signing it. She said, "I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like something someone would put on a coffee mug. But I need you to understand the quality of the transmission. It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't comfort the way a person offers comfort to soften something hard. It was," she paused, "it was structural, like being handed information that reorganizes everything else, like finding out something was true, that you'd been building your life around assuming was probably false. I asked her which word hit the hardest. She said, 'Enough,' because I had spent 47 years in a world organized around deficit. The thing I lacked was one of the most fundamental ways human beings connect with one another. I had made peace with that. I thought I had, anyway. But I hadn't understood until that voice that making peace with and knowing it's enough are not the same thing." She came back screaming. Not from pain, from the magnitude of what was being taken away. Here is the part I keep returning to. When Claire coded, the cardiologist was positioned at her left side. The crash cart was behind her and to the left. Standard cath lab setup. Maria, the scrub tech, was standing at Claire's right, approximately 18 inches forward of her shoulder, at approximately the level of Claire's face. When the monitor alarmed, Maria called out Claire's name. She told me this herself, 3 months after the fact, when I asked directly. She called it by reflex, the instinct of someone who has spent years in clinical settings where calling to a patient is part of the response, even when she knew intellectually that Claire couldn't hear her. She was calling from the right side, slightly forward, at approximately the level of Claire's face. That is exactly where Claire located the voice. Not a vague, "somewhere on my right." Claire drew a diagram. 18 inches. Forward. Face level. There is no version of standard NDE physiology that accounts for spatial perception of vocal sources in a brain with no blood flow and no prior auditory processing architecture. The auditory cortex in a person born with profound sensorineural hearing loss does not develop auditory pathways in the way a hearing person's cortex does. The brain reassigns that real estate. Claire's brain was not wired for auditory localization. She had never needed it, and she was in asystole. In 1999, Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper published MindSight, a 4-year study of near-death and out-of-body experiences in blind individuals. They documented 31 cases, including people blind from birth, who reported detailed visual perception during their NDEs, accurate descriptions of the resuscitation room, colors they had never experienced, the position of medical personnel, things verified independently afterward. Ring called the phenomenon transcendental awareness, perception that doesn't require the physical sensory apparatus to function, because it doesn't originate there. The parallel is almost exact. Jeffrey Long, through the NDERF database, over 5,000 verified accounts, has documented more than a dozen cases of congenitally deaf individuals reporting auditory elements during NDEs. The pattern in those descriptions is consistent, not hearing in the normal sense, but understanding that arrived as sound, comprehension without intermediary, language received rather than decoded. And here is the piece of neurology that I cannot get past. Van Lommel's prospective study in The Lancet, 344 cardiac arrest patients, published in 2001, found that the occurrence of NDE was not correlated with the duration of cardiac arrest, not with how long the brain was without oxygen. If NDE were a product of a dying brain generating final signals, you'd expect longer arrests to produce more vivid experiences. They don't. The experience seems to be independent of the mechanism that should be producing it. For Claire, the mechanism for auditory experience didn't just temporarily fail. It was never there to begin with. And she heard something. I want to tell you something about what Claire's case did to me. I have been afraid for most of my adult life of a specific version of death. Not the pain of dying. Not even the loss. I have been afraid of the silence. The absolute, permanent silence I imagined was waiting. The lights going out and nothing. Not peace. Just cessation. The thing that isn't anything at all. In 22 years of ICU work, I held that fear quietly. I got good at setting it aside during shifts, compartmentalizing the way nurses do, but it was always there, underneath. When I sat with patients in their final hours, there was always a part of me asking, is this the last thing? Is this just silence now? Claire was born into the silence I was afraid of. She lived 47 years in it. She built a full, rich, meaningful life inside it. She is the person who knows better than almost anyone alive what it is like to inhabit the thing I was bracing for. And then she died. And what she found on the other side of that silence was not more silence. She found a voice. She found it in the exact location of a person who was calling to her from the living world, with hands that were trying to bring her back, in a voice she had never in 47 years been able to hear. And what it said was, "You are enough." I don't know what theological framework holds that, if any. I'm not a theologian. I don't know what the voice was exactly, or where it came from, or whether it was Maria's voice amplified by something vast, or whether it was something else entirely using that location as an anchor to reach someone who had never been reachable that way before. What I know is this: the person most accustomed to silence, the person the living world had never been able to reach through sound, was not forgotten on the other side of the monitor going flat. Whatever is there found a way to reach her. Found a way through a door that had never been open. If it could find her, I stopped being afraid it couldn't find me. Claire asked Maria a question when she woke up. Before she understood fully where she was, before the interpreter arrived, before the anesthesia had fully cleared, she turned toward where she sensed Maria was standing, and she signed it with trembling hands. The question was, do you think it was meant for me? Or does everyone get to hear it? Maria didn't understand ASL. She didn't know what Claire had asked until later, when the interpreter translated the question. But she told me, when I called 3 months afterward, that when she saw Claire turn toward her and sign something, still disoriented, still between wherever she'd been and here, she felt, without understanding the words, that the question was important, that it deserved a real answer. I've been sitting with that question ever since. I think it was both. I think the voice found Claire because she was there and because she needed it. And I think what it said is not private, not a message sealed for her alone. I think, "You are enough," was transmitted to someone who had spent 47 years measuring herself against a world she could only partially access, and that the transmission was exact, precise, aimed at the wound with the kind of accuracy that means something was paying attention. If you are sitting in a kind of silence right now, not the literal silence Claire lives in, but the silence of grief, the silence of feeling unseen, the silence of carrying something no one around you seems to be able to hear. I want you to know that Claire's case is the one I return to most. Not because of the proof, not because of the spatial localization of the voice, or the research on blind perception, or the neurological impossibility of auditory cortex activation without blood flow. Because of the direction it came from. Someone called her name. She was in a place where she should not have been able to hear it, and she turned toward the sound.